sit, if that's okay. I'd be interested in knowing if all those passes were positive passes or negative passes. Negative passes? Negative passes? Negative? Yeah. Neutral pass? Neutral pass?
That's real pass.
Yeah, no. I mean, I watched Stoker for the first time in preparation for this. And I had been familiar with Park Chan-wook's other films, not all of them, but primarily the three films that his international reputation has been based on, which are, beginning with Old Boy and the three films that are called the Vengeance Trilogy. And so I think that probably, like a lot of people who were familiar with those movies, and this is something that we tend to do, is you go in with even sometimes an idea of those other films and other works in your mind, and they become the framework in which you have the experience of sort of watching the movie. And I don't think in that case it was particularly helpful, for me anyway, because Stoker, in neither a positive nor negative way, is no Old Boy. It's not. If you have seen, well, how many people have seen Old Boy? Okay, a few people have. Okay, Old Boy was released in 2003, and it was selected for the Cannes Film Festival, and it was intensely divisive in terms of its audience response. It was considered to be very violent. It's about a man who does not know why he has been locked up for what amounts to a few years, and after he is released from this horrible experience of being locked up and deprived of basically all contact with the outside world, goes on a quest to find who it was who imprisoned him, and then to wreak vengeance. And the theme of vengeance, the theme of extremely violent vengeance, is very strong in in Park's films, especially in this trilogy. The film Old Boy was extremely significant also in terms of essentially putting the South Korean film on the global festival circuit. The South Korean film became something which a lot of press attention was being paid to, and it's really very interesting how many of these films dealt with violence. Very dark films, often horror films, crime films, often very explicit in terms of the violence that they depicted. What tends to happen inevitably in the global filmmaking market is that if you have a very successful film in your country, and I would argue that the vengeance films are very much reflect a certain kind of uncertainty and darkness in the South Korean experience. What happens, of course, is that you get ripped out of your home context, dropped into the middle of the United States, and you're told to make a commercial film. This has happened over and over and over and over again. Some filmmakers have managed to leave their countries and to come to the United States and make very interesting films, and make, in some cases, artistically successful films. Every once in a while, they will make a commercially successful film. Often what happens, though, to these filmmakers is that when they are taken out of their cultural context, and when they are required to make films in the sort of the industrial context of the American film industry, their films lose a kind of sense of identity. They lose a sense of place. Sometimes they feel like they are a little bit stranded. The movies themselves can kind of, you feel like you're looking from the perspective of the other into American culture. Sometimes filmmakers can use that outside perspective on American culture in order to create very interesting comments on American society. Stoker is a film that in some ways was inevitable. It was inevitable that after the success of the Vengeance movies that Park would be offered an English language movie with movie stars. That was bound to happen. What's very interesting is that this is the film that he chose to make. This is a film that was written by someone who is more well known as an actor than a writer, a guy by the name of Wentworth Miller. If you saw the television series that was on 6 or 7 years ago called Prison Break, he was one of those guys with the shaved head who was running around from week to week to try to save a prison. Also a writer. He wrote the script for Stoker a number of years ago. He wrote it under another name, which is kind of interesting. He wrote it under another name because he didn't want people to think that the only reason the film got produced is because he was an actor. He's not that famous an actor, but anyway, he wrote it under an assumed name. And he wrote 2 scripts. There is also a story that takes place previous to Stoker, which is the backstory of Uncle Charlie, and Uncle Charlie is the name of that particular script. The inspiration for Stoker is, as was pointed out, a 1942 Alfred Hitchcock movie called Shadow of a Doubt. Shadow of a Doubt is considered to be one of Hitchcock's best but least appreciated movies. Unlike a lot of Hitchcock's movies like Psycho and the Birds and North by Northwest, it's not one of the ones that tends to be very often available to be seen. But historically significant, very historically significant. And primarily it was historically significant because it was about a likable psychopath character. The character it takes place in a small town in California, and it's about the arrival on the doorstep of a kind of a picture-perfect American family of a figure who is a long-lost uncle with a mysterious past, and the film is told from the point of view of his niece. She becomes completely enthralled by him, seduced by his charm, and it's only through the gradual revealing of details, which is something that Alfred Hitchcock is so unbelievably brilliant at, that we begin to realize that all is not right with Uncle Charlie. And as his niece begins to suspect that Uncle Charlie might be a dangerous influence and might have ulterior motives to his presence in the small town, our entire relationship to him changes. And the film makes a very, very interesting turn from being what at first appears to be almost a kind of an uplifting Frank Capra-like family drama, and it starts to turn. And it gets darker and darker, and it literally gets darker until the point where by the end of A Shadow of a Doubt, a movie that had largely been taking place during the day, in daylight, has turned into a kind of a film noir by the time you get to it. It's a really amazing movie. But where it was most significant was, up until that point, primarily, in Hollywood movies anyway, if somebody was a bad character, they were a bad character from the moment they walked on screen. You knew they were. The simplification of the storytelling usually allowed you to determine who was good, who was bad from the very beginning. Hitchcock liked to play with that. he spent a lot of his career manipulating the audience, and he never made any apologies for this at all. As an artist, the thing that Alfred Hitchcock was most interested in was basically messing with our minds. And he was an absolute genius at it, and he understood that the cinema, film, had a power to manipulate our emotions and our responses in a ways that very few other art forms did. And I mention this and talk about it at length because when people talk about the influence of Alfred Hitchcock, what they tend to be talking about, usually, they say Hitchcockian, which is a word that is, if I don't ever hear it or see it used again, that will be fine. Because most of the time, what it means is this movie has suspense in it, so it's Hitchcockian, right? Or somebody gets killed in a shower, or whatever, right? It's called Hitchcockian. But when we are talking about the Hitchcock style, what we really need to be talking about is the power he had as an artist to manipulate the expectations of his audience. And I don't use that in a negative sense, because particularly with film, and particularly with Hollywood film, we're talking about forms and formula. To a large extent, when we go into a Hollywood movie, we go into that movie with certain expectations of what is going to happen. This is the funny kind of an arrangement that we have as popular audiences. We want to be thrilled by movies. We want movies to divert us. We want to be surprised by them, but we also want them to fulfill our expectations when we go in. And so that's why genre, particular story forms, have become so incredibly popular and consistent, and basically, and although the genres themselves have changed over the years, genre is still one of the strongest ways of categorizing and marketing Hollywood films. There would have been a time where, for example, the leading genres would have been horror movies, musicals, gangster movies, what were called at that point somewhat condescendingly, they would have been called women's melodramas. There were crime movies, and the most popular of them all in the 20th century, the most influential Hollywood genre in the 20th century was the Western. And so, over the years, some of these elements have changed. You look out today, right, and we could just take a look at what's playing at the Varsity here or something, and it's probably, for the most part, there's a couple of action movies. There would be a romantic comedy or two. There would be although these are kind of mixing up a little bit, there would be what I would call a kind of a comedy, sort of a gross-out comedy, right? Which is aimed at sort of teenagers and used to be just young men, but now more and more appeals to young women as well, and it's also crossing over into the romantic comedy. And of course, there would be horror movies are still being made, science fiction, fantasy movies, and of course now the most popular form of movie on the planet is the superhero movie. So it's always a question of genres, and genres, as I say, are based on, and often what we will say is, you will say that you will choose a movie according to its genre. I don't like, for example, I'm throwing this out, you'll say to yourself, I don't really like romantic comedies, or I'm tired of superhero movies, or I haven't seen a good horror movie in a long time, and you'll make your choice according to the genre. And your experience when you go in is, as I say, is often determined by this kind of strange balance between your expectations, but your hope that the movie will fulfill those expectations, but at the same time won't just do the same thing over and over again. Now, what Alfred Hitchcock did as an artist was his films were often, they were marketed as suspense films. They were marketed as, sometimes they were crime films. Sometimes they were thought to be horror films. He was the master of suspense. So he worked within a kind of a genre. But what Hitchcock liked to do more than anything else, as I said, was to basically take your expectations and turn them inside out. Now, he would do this in a number of ways. But most effectively, the way he did it was he loved to use our expectations of particular movie stars and turn those inside out. So if you thought, for instance, Cary Grant was the most lovable, handsome, decent, perfect man in the world, or you thought James Stewart was, what Alfred Hitchcock liked to do is to put them on screen, have you fall in love with them, and then make them do something terrible. Because that puts you in a position where it's like you suddenly aren't sure how you're supposed to respond. You're not really sure how you are supposed to respond. And what it also means is that if you have decided that you have great affection for a particular character and movie star, and they do something awful, suddenly part of the experience of the movie itself is our moral relationship with the movie. It becomes very complicated. If we're sitting and watching a movie and we're basically endorsing behavior that we would otherwise think is not good behavior, is not something we would do, then Hitchcock has got us in a very, very interesting place. Hitchcock also realized, as a filmmaker, that we loved, very simply, sex and violence. He understood that these were two elements that in the cinema could be more powerful and more enticing than just about anything. And the great thing about Hitchcock was that he was working in an era where he could not be explicit. He had to be suggestive. He had to suggest sexuality. He had to suggest the threat of violence. And it was through that suggestion, editing, color, music, all the elements available to him as a filmmaker, that he would make selections in his movies according to creating a sense of mood, creating a sense of playing with our involvement, or creating a sense of menace, creating a sense of violence, creating a sense of eroticism, which had to be, again, suggested and not explicitly kind of laid out. Now, to get to something like Stoker many years later, Alfred Hitchcock, he died in 1980. His influence, as I say, often has been just simply, it becomes, his name has become a kind of brand in itself. It's a Hitchcock movie. It's a Hitchcockian movie, right? It doesn't really mean anything. It's just, oh, okay, right, I get that. But his influence as a filmmaker is really more apparent, as I say, in the legacy of certain types of filmmaking, but mostly in films that engage us on a very complicated sort of moral and ethical level. Wentworth Miller, the writer of this script, as I say, was a big, big Alfred Hitchcock fan. A huge fan, particularly of Shadow of a Doubt. His script had been kicking around for a couple of years. It was unproduced. And when it came to Park's first opportunity to write an English language film, when this script was taken to him, he immediately responded to it because his favorite film of all time, the most influential film in terms of his career, is an Alfred Hitchcock movie called Vertigo. Vertigo is a particularly perverse kind of movie masterpiece. Vertigo is a movie that was released in 1959, 1960. It made a little bit of money, but it was largely considered one of Alfred Hitchcock's biggest failures. In fact, it was after the failure, the commercial, the rather lukewarm commercial response to the movie Vertigo, that Alfred Hitchcock said, okay, what I'm going to do is I'm going to make a movie that is very cheap, that is shot in black and white. I'm going to use the same crew that I used for my television show, and I'm going to show you that you can make a popular, terrifying, commercially successful film with no money whatsoever. And he went and made Psycho after he made Vertigo. Part of the reason he made Psycho was because he felt that his career might be in trouble because he'd spent so much money on Vertigo. That being said, Vertigo is an absolutely incredible movie. And what is very interesting about Vertigo is that it casts the actor James Stewart, one of the most beloved Hollywood actors of all time, as a man who over the course of the film becomes increasingly unhinged and crazy. The vertigo in the movie itself, on the one hand, refers to the James Stewart character's experience, his lifelong experience that he had as a policeman, where in trying to, he nearly fell off a building chasing a criminal, and so he has a sense every time he gets up to a certain height that he can no longer keep his balance. He can't see things properly. He has a sense of vertigo that he's going to fall. And this sense of falling is a very powerful element in the movie. He falls for a woman, but he believes that this woman is actually dead. When he sees another woman who looks like the woman that he's become obsessed with, he becomes obsessed with recreating the dead woman in this other woman that he has found that has looked like her. It is a movie completely about obsession. It is a movie completely about seduction. It uses color, it uses music, it uses camera angles to create a complete sense of a mind coming apart. And I think that in a way, if you look at something like Old Boy, directed by Park, you can feel the influence of a film like Vertigo. You can feel the influence of a world in which the character whom we are seeing the world through his eyes has a very precarious relationship with the world. He can't really understand it. The interesting thing then, so Vertigo is a huge influence on Park. He loves that movie. So when he gets the script for Stoker, he very clearly sees, I'm going to go to the United States and I have an opportunity to maybe make something like an Alfred Hitchcock movie. And the thing that is interesting about Stoker is that although it's made in the United States with some American money, it's actually a British production and it is loaded with Australian actors. And it's like, which is very kind of interesting. But when we talk about the role of the other in the cinema, what's interesting about a film like Stoker is that the whole world kind of feels alien. The whole world feels strange. From the very beginning of the film, I think that what is the intention of the filmmaker is for us to be slightly tilted off balance. We are very quickly introduced to a character whose perception of the world is not quite accurate. We are not entirely sure of the reliability of her perception of the world. This is reinforced through the editing, through the sense of, through the very, very vivid use of color in the film, the sense of the very particular way that the space in the mansion itself you'll notice that there is a pattern to the way that things are shot inside that house. It is very rare that you see, as the movie goes on, a camera set up within the house that hasn't already been established earlier on. So it sets up a sense of familiar space, but strange, disorienting space in the house itself. That is a fairly common strategy for the creation of suspense, because if you can create in our minds a sense of visual stability, and then you slowly begin to manipulate that stability and shift the angles and shift the colors, then what happens is, even on a level that we're not often aware of, we are being put on edge. We are being asked to, our own perception of the film becomes like the perception of the young character of India. It begins to become sort of unreliable. Now, the figure of Uncle Charlie is also an interesting figure. There is a kind of figure that persists certainly in literature and certainly through, and also I would say through films, many films kind of made around the world, not restricted to Hollywood films at all. And that is the character who shows up and who at first appearance is a likable character, a charismatic character, and whose presence, whose arrival begins to threaten the stability of the family when he arrives. Now, what's interesting is that from Stoker, from the beginning, the family isn't stable. And that might be, I'm not sure if it's deliberate, but it might be one of the things that about the film that it makes it somewhat challenging to kind of emotionally identify with. Because from the beginning, everybody seems a little strange. Everybody seems a little off. But normally what happens is that you are presented with the idea of normalcy, a normal family. And it is the introduction of this character that makes that, throws all of that very idea of what is normal into doubt. This is often the function of an other character, is that they arrive, and what we realize is that it's the family itself, it's family relations which are unreliable. It's family relations that often conceal great darkness, great secrets, great pain. This is something, again, that Alfred Hitchcock absolutely loved. But what is and often the other figure can be, the other figure can be an alien figure, the other figure can be a psychopath, the other figure can be a monster in horror movies. The other figure is often a character who is also very seductive. The other figure often brings a kind of aura of sexual threat into an environment, and in many cases, what he does is, in that he, doesn't have to be a he, sometimes it's a she, what that character does is kind of reveal also the sexual dysfunction or the absence of sex in a particular environment. The interesting thing about Stoker is that I don't think that this movie really cares about, and this is not criticizing it, I don't think Park cares about the idea of American normality. I don't think he probably doesn't believe in it. And what's interesting is that from the moment that you are introduced to this family, in this house and in this community, it doesn't feel real. It is not something which, and because of that, because everything seems to be already so stylized and so broken up, what it means is that the idea of normality being threatened, normality breaking down, never really happens in Stoker, because there isn't really a normality to start with that is threatened or is broken down. And I think that what's really interesting is my sense of the film, and again, this is just on one viewing, and I would happily watch it again, is I think it is an absolutely beautifully made film. I think that some of the particularly the attention paid to color, the attention paid to space. What's interesting is the music score, which is by a guy by the name of Clint Mansell, is something which again is really kind of crucial. But what I felt was a filmmaker who was more interested in the prospect of the little challenges of paying honor to Alfred Hitchcock. I felt that it was a film that was kind of more interested in filmmaking than it was in its characters. And that can be okay. In some ways, you know, Alfred Hitchcock, in so many of his movies, he wasn't interested in his characters either. He wasn't really very interested in them. But what happens, I think, in Stoker is that some of the individual set pieces in the film, I think, are breathtaking and are great. But one thing, again, to get back to where I started, and then I will wrap this up and we can move on. But one of the things is that from within about the first 5 minutes of the film, with the arrival of Uncle Charlie, the film held no surprises for me. It held no surprises for me. And that can be, again, in terms of our engagement with a movie, you can forgive a film for not surprising you if that's kind of what you wanted to do. And in many cases, I think, you know, for example, in a superhero movie, the fewer surprises, the better. Or you want the surprises are, you know, will come to you. You want to see them on the technical level. You want to see them with the computer-generated effects. But in this case, you know, as soon as Uncle Charlie arrives, it's like, okay, this guy's going to be messing with everybody. And also, we have had at the beginning the kind of the decision to structure the film as it was hints at the darkness in the lead character from the very beginning. So you know that at a certain point, that's going to be brought out as well, right? So in a very kind of interesting way, the movie tells you everything that's going to happen from the beginning of the film. And and what's interesting about that is that, you know, you can look at that and say, well, then this is a film that is asking us to pay attention to something else. Maybe it's asking us to pay attention to the filmmaking. And if you do pay attention to the filmmaking, it's extraordinary. It's extraordinarily good. But the problem is that for me, ultimately, what this led to was a film that essentially failed to engage me very deeply on an emotional level, and it also failed to engage me just on a level of sort of like genre amusement, largely because, as I say, it pretty much played out according to exactly what I was, you know, kind of expecting it to do. That being said, and I'll wrap it up with that. That being said, 20 minutes were cut out of this film. Did you know that? Mm-hmm. 20 minutes were cut out of this film before it was released. You know. Now, I don't know. I'm sure that a lot of you who didn't like the film, the idea of a 20-minute longer version of Stoker is just not. But sometimes that can make a difference. You know, it would be very interesting to see, for instance, perhaps those 20 minutes involve more in terms of the character interaction. Perhaps those 20 minutes involve things that don't quite reduce the film to what simply seems to be kind of an exercise in homage, an exercise in genre. But it is. I mean, I think ultimately, it was a film that I would, say that, I enjoyed watching it. But what I could feel in it was a kind of a detachment on the part of the filmmaker, and a filmmaker who kind of like seemed more motivated by making, by paying homage to Alfred Hitchcock than by actually doing something all that different with the genre. So that's a lot of talk right there.
Okay.
You asked for it.
Thank you, guys. So we'll just go